everybody. You're watching The Political Vigilante. My name is Graham Elwood. I'm joined by Rania Khalek. Rania, how you doing?
I'm good.
Please hit the like button. Share it, do all that stuff that helps analytically. I wanted to talk to you. So we were just talking about that insane CIA woke video, which is just like par for the course for this. And boy, is that going to make some people go back to brunch. But so we were talking about the CIA's involvement, and I wanted to get into because Syria is kind of coming back in the news through the corporate lens that gets its talking points from the State Department. You've lived in the Middle East. I don't know, maybe you currently are living in the Middle East. What are you seeing now from that? So you're in the Middle East right now?
Right now, I happen to be passing through the U.S. I'm visiting my family, but I will be back in a couple weeks. Yeah.
All right. So what have you seen? And how are you? Because the Biden-Harris regime is really trying to sound like we're so woke and everything's going to be so much better than Trump. And Trump tried to pull people out of Syria, but then said, I'm going to leave military to guard the oil. Mm-hmm. Which is like, you're not allowed to tell the truth.
At least he was honest, right?
He was honest. So how are you seeing this Biden administration and the American empire from that side? Because that's the other thing that drives me nuts about the liberals, especially, living and working in LA and show business, is they just think they have no concept of what's happening in the Middle East, and they will defend war when a Democrat does it. Mm-hmm. And just say Trump, bad Trump. And when Trump tried to pull out, even though there's much to be critical of Trump on, I'm glad he's gone. But when he tried to end war, pull out, they would criticize him. Oh, he's going to destabilize the region thing. So Biden already has broken the May 1st pull out of Afghanistan that was agreed upon in February of last year. Now he's saying September 11. So, I mean, how are you seeing all this from someone who's been there? Parents are from there and are really has been following this pretty closely.
So I actually do think that the Biden administration ultimately will pull out of Afghanistan. They don't really have a choice. The U.S. has kind of already pulled out of Afghanistan. It's been doing so gradually for the last decade. And pulling out really just means pulling out physical U.S. troops and NATO troops. But the U.S. has also spent the last 20 years arming the Afghan army and the Afghan police. And they've been training them to basically do it for America. So America doesn't have to. And that's really why there's been so few I don't think there's been a single death of a U.S. soldier in the last year in Afghanistan, because there's only 2,500 left. And I think the reason they're pulling out, I mean, if you look at what Biden said in his speech, he actually made a comment in his speech about the withdrawal where he said, we have to, focus on the challenge with China. So it's like a part of this pullout is a faction of the U.S. government recognizes that the real conflict, the real challenge, the real threat to U.S. hegemony is the economic rise of China and this great power competition that the U.S. has really been moving towards and kind of got diverted, distracted with the war on terror. But we've always been moving in this direction of, escalation and Cold War with China. That said, that's just Afghanistan. We're talking about Syria. There's a continuity of U.S. foreign policy always between administrations, between parties, because we have a bipartisan foreign policy that really doesn't change that much. That there are slight differences and slight nuances. I don't want to completely downplay them. Obviously, Obama, a Republican, would not have done the Iran nuclear deal. So there's nuances like that for sure. That said, so far under this Joe Biden administration, nothing's changed. The sanctions on Iran are still there. Mm-hmm. They're still denying Iranians access to medicine and fuel and normal lives. Collectively, it's collective punishment, which is a war crime. The sanctions on Syria are even more severe. And the U.S. is still occupying Syria, and the Biden administration is going to continue occupying Syria. Trump was honest with us and told us why. Was to guard the oil. It's also to try to balkanize Syria. The U.S. is occupying a huge chunk of Syria and has a proxy force that they're funding with the YPG, they've renamed the Syrian Democratic Forces, and this area of northeast Syria that is actually the most fertile area of Syria. And as Trump alluded to with we're there to guard the oil, it's the most oil rich area of Syria. So Syria is under these sanctions that have totally collapsed the currency and ruined its economy. And on top of that, because of this area that the US and its proxy forces are occupying, the Syrian government is actually forced to purchase wheat and oil, its own wheat and oil from its own territory that the US is illegally occupying. It's forced to purchase its own resources back from the SDF, which is the group that the US is funding to basically be in charge as the authority of the area. But the Syrian currency has been devalued so dramatically because of US sanctions that they're not even able to purchase their own oil back. So there's fuel shortages in Syria. I mean, Syria is situated in one of the most oil-rich areas of the world. It's the Middle East. And they have a fuel shortage because of these sanctions and because of this occupation of Syrian territory by the US and its proxies. And wheat. They have a wheat shortage. They have a food shortage because they can't buy back their own wheat because they just don't have the hard currency for it because their currency is worthless. And then there's this other area of Syria, the northern area, which is occupied by a mix of the Turkish military, as well as this group called HTS, which is the former Al-Qaeda affiliate that has now said, we're not Al-Qaeda anymore. Which US officials have actually called an asset, which they actually are in charge of this region of Syria because the US was arming and funding all these Islamist groups that were able to collapse the government in certain areas of the country. Thankfully, they weren't able to collapse the government in the entire country, or else you would have seen the ISIS flag flying in Damascus. But anyways, then there's this other area of northern Syria that is basically like becoming a part of Turkey at this point. So that's the situation for Syrians right now. I mean, I have a lot of Syrian friends. A lot of them have left the country. Those that remain in the country are telling me that it's worse than it was when there was a hot war taking place because of these sanctions. I mean, if you think about what sanctions do, it makes your salary completely worthless. Maybe today I make $40,000 a year. Well, if Syrian currency crashes because of American sanctions, now my $40,000 just became $4,000 or maybe even less. So I have less money. I have no future. The country is there's no jobs anymore. Everyone's leaving. The hospitals are running out of medicine. Syria used to have some of the best health infrastructure in the region, and they had free medical care. A lot of people from surrounding countries would actually go to Syria to get medical care because it was really good and it was free or almost free. That doesn't exist anymore. Now, people were saying to me a couple months ago, because, coronavirus was really bad in Syria. Everybody had it. The hospitals weren't equipped to deal with it. I was hearing that, there's more equipment in a Lebanese ambulance than there is in a Syrian hospital right now. Because what sanctions do is it makes it impossible to get the replacement parts for like basic things like a dialysis machine. So if my dad needs dialysis, well, where the hell is he going to get it now? There's no dialysis machines left because they can't purchase them and they can't get the replacement parts. I mean, there's so much that sanctions do, and it's such an unemotional and like cold term. And people don't see it as war, but it really is economic terrorism. It really, really is. And it's just the US, because of sanctions, there's all these areas of Syria where there was fighting, where it's now calm and there's local ceasefires, but there's rubble everywhere. Syria cannot rebuild anything because the US has even, used sanctions to make it impossible for Syria to import the materials to rebuild what's been destroyed. So there's just rubble everywhere. Wherever there was war, wherever there was bombing, wherever there was gunshots, people's houses are still destroyed. They can't rebuild anything. I mean, it's like, and the US spent 10 years arming and funding one of the biggest covert operations in history, a collection of jihadist groups that were either Al-Qaeda affiliates or working alongside Al-Qaeda. The organization that, that did 9/11, the organization that we've been invoking for the past 20 years to do war all around the world, we were funding them in Syria. We were actually funding them. I mean, think about that. Think about if you're Syrian and in your backyard, someone's, this country on the other side of the world is funding Al-Qaeda to destroy you. Like, that's what the US was doing to Syria. So after destroying the country by funding a civil war, basically funding the KKK of the Middle East, the US is now making it impossible for people to rebuild their lives. It's sadistic. And Biden, sorry, this question started about Biden. Biden has done absolutely nothing to change that. In fact, the rhetoric is exactly the same. Assad is evil, Syria is evil, Syria needs to be punished, so on and so forth.
Well, yeah, and God, thanks for going into the details on that. Yeah, and of course the mainstream media will not acknowledge that we have been funding Al-Qaeda. Like they just won't. And if you speak out, you get crushed. I mean, you're called an Assad apologist. I mean, that just happens just automatically. I mean, and and going back to the other thing we were talking about with that, the intersectional wokeism that's happening. It's Biden's most diverse, his most diverse cabinet ever. It's the first black man head of the, Secretary of Defense who's on Raytheon's board of directors. So of course nothing is going to change. That's the thing you said at the top of this is America's, foreign policy rarely change. I mean, the one thing constant, like, Obama might do the Iran nuclear deal, but the military, we're spending money on war. Which wars, how to spend, that's up for debate. But no war is never in the conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Never. It's never allowed to be in the conversation. I mean, any country, North Korea, here's how we might do war. It's always war talk. And there's no diversity of ideology in Biden's cabinet at all. I mean, you've got Janet Yellen, first female head. She made $1.7 million in speaking.
They're all millionaires. They're all millionaires. They're all elites and millionaires. They all went to the same colleges, the same Ivy League schools. They were all groomed in the same way. They think exactly the same. They might as well just be a bunch of robots that just look a little different. That's all it is,
So, and then the thing that's so insane is, I mean, the domestic policy and the foreign policy are very similar. And I wish more Americans would make this connection. They're kind of waking up to the fact of the defund the police movement of like, take Los Angeles. I always use this as an example because it's a huge city. 54% of LA's yearly operating budget goes to LAPD. 54%.
That's crazy. That's insane. That shows you priorities are messed up.
Messed up. And I defy you to drive more than a mile in LA and not see a homeless encampment. I defy you. You can't. Unless you're driving through Beverly Hills.
Every time I come back to this country and I like travel through any city, I was recently in New York. And then of course, like I'm in the DC area right now. It's like the homeless situation is just always worse than it was the last time I was here.
Always. It has gotten worse. Name something that's better in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
You can't, unless you're a billionaire. Right. I mean, things are great for you. And so the people are starting to realize, oh, wow. And they're talking about it in Minneapolis and in other cities. But like, if we cut the cops' budget in half, and like, let's just say LA or any big city, and spent that money on housing the homeless, not shelters, homes, and funding and drug treatment and mental illness treatment, then the cops wouldn't have to deal with half of these problems.
Right.
And then we wouldn't have this, and that money would be. It's the same thing in the foreign policy. We outspend the next 10 countries combined. If we cut our military budget in half, we would still have roughly 200 some billion dollars more than China, who's the next country who spends
that's crazy.
It's crazy. And so much of this is obviously fueled by the petrodollar. And the oil, that's obviously the Middle East, and which is, tied into America's, its power and its leverage and its empire. So how do you see this? I mean,
it's like you have this parasitic class of elites that just like, they want more and more. They're so disconnected from regular people. And it's not even them as it's not them personally. It's a system. Like capitalism is a system that requires bigger monopolies and more extraction and more inequality to exist. And there's been attempted reforms throughout its existence, right? Like the New Deal was an attempted reform at capitalism to prevent a workers' uprising, to prevent a communist uprising. I mean, one of the reasons Europeans have the kinds of benefits they have, whether it's like subsidized, government-backed healthcare or free daycare, depends which country you're talking about, but they definitely have a way bigger social safety net than Americans do. One of the reasons for that is because of the Marshall Plan, because after World War II, the US had the Soviet Union to compete with. And because of these kinds of inequalities, communism was really attractive to working people because it guaranteed you the kinds of things that capitalism can't. And in order to challenge that, there had to be reforms. There had to be these kinds of welfare policies, these social safety net policies. And that, it never happened quite as great in America. We don't have what Europeans have, but there was at least some attempts at reform with the New Deal. And I feel like, this is just, it's predictable that the system would go kind of revert back to this. Because again, capitalism is all about a small group of people, a handful of people. When you think about the ratio, really like making all the money while the rest of us are just like they're slaves. That's essentially what capitalism is, who have to work for like this meager wage so that we can afford the basics we need to live. And it's getting to a point where the inequality is getting so bad that people are really unhappy. And one of my biggest fears, this wasn't really your question, but it's just kind of like, this is where my mind goes. One of my biggest fears is that, when you look at the media, this kind of goes back to the suppression your show's facing. When you look at the media apparatus that we have right now, where you have these algorithms that are suppressing alternative left-wing sources and trying to like elevate the CNNs and, the MSNBCs, people are really unhappy with what's happening. They know that there's something wrong with the system, but the sources that would actually explain to those people why that they feel the way they feel, would explain their conditions to them, the leftist sources are being suppressed. And all that's left is like mainstream media, which nobody trusts or believes in, and then a really well-funded right-wing media apparatus that tells them the problem is immigrants, right? The problem is Black people. The problem is like, all of these like crazy anarchists, right? Like the problem is the communist, China's Communist Party is out to get you. Like, and so my fear is that like we have a situation where it's either socialism or fascism. Like, which one do you want, right? It's socialism or barbarism. And what I see so far is a disturbing development of like the fascist side winning out, at least the narrative war. And part of that is the fault of the liberal elites who are using their power to try to control a narrative. And to do that, they're actually attacking the left. They're attacking people like us. They're demonetizing our channels. They're making it more difficult for us to reach an audience. Because at the end of the day, the message people like you or I are putting forth is the more dangerous message to their bottom line, right?
Yeah, it's absolutely the case. That's absolutely the case. And you're right. There is a very well-funded right wing that pushes all these sort of xenophobic tropes. And they're talking about, they equate socialism with like Stalin era totalitarian communism, like from the Soviet Union. They don't even know what it is. Like anything socialist is,
it's just a boogeyman. It's like a boogeyman. It doesn't even matter what it is almost. It's just this like this big scary thing that wants to like make everybody, that wants to like eliminate the white race, or like wants to, make you pay for rich kids to go to college. I don't know, whatever stupid tropes that are being pushed by like, are being pushed to try to discredit, left-wing ideas. But I do think it's like that's why channels like yours end up getting demonetized and suppressed, because what you're saying is actually more dangerous to a bunch of oligarchs than what some like QAnon person is saying.
Yeah, because the QAnon, you can just go, oh, they're nuts. They're crazy.
Yeah.
They're, and this is like, and that's the thing with like this show, I'm sure yours, I definitely know this from Jimmy, and like, just from like, I've pulled a lot of former Trump supporters and conservatives and libertarians over to this side, in addition to all of the like lefties who are done with the Democratic Party, because they're like, wow, you're calling out all sides. I'm like, yeah, it's all. And once people wake up, as you said early on in this conversation, that we are in class warfare, and they have a very sophisticated propaganda machine to tell you that it isn't class warfare. So whatever you're watching, if you're watching Fox and the right, you're getting that type of propaganda. If you're watching the MSNBC crowd, you're getting the other propaganda. Oh, it's everything's Russia's fault or whatever. or even QAnon. You're getting that very packaged, specific type of propaganda. And so they don't want, and that's easy. Just getting people, they want us all divided, distracted, and afraid, because as you pointed out with, the depression of the 30s, communism and socialism were really gaining, really severe ground. And people were like, we're done. And look, the Soviet Revolution had already happened. And what was that, 1917? So people were like, knew about it, heard about it, were ready to go on board with it. And they have just, for the last, 80, 90 years, have done a good job of propagandizing people into thinking that capitalism is so great. And so much so that, like, I've done videos talking about, well, I like Bitcoin. Well, you're not a socialist, Graham. You just all care about this money. And I'm like, what? It's the most democratic form of money out there. Like,
probably I don't know much about Bitcoin, but it's probably also safer than like your money in a bank that's really just all one big Ponzi scheme anyway.
Yeah, yes, I know. They're just
they are banks banks all around the world are literally just one big Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, that was the whole thing. And if the banks go belly up, they'll get bailed out.
Yeah.
Our tax, they'll print more money to bail them out. So the question I have is, because you're talking about, we're getting down to this like decision or choice, unfortunately, between like fascism and socialism. And the fascism of Biden is even more scary, because Trump's fascism was at least overt. You saw it. And now it's like the fascism, we're going to put a rainbow flag around it. So yay, we did it. Everyone, like, even when what was happening in Portland last summer, and they're like, these federal cops are snatching people up off the streets, and they're like, Trump. And I'm like, no, that was the NDAA signed by Obama in 2011.
Portland is like the most democratic city ever.
Yes.
Like,
democratic
Trump is not in charge of Portland.
Yeah. So, but this is the thing. And I've talked about this on this show and again, especially when you see like AOC and the squad now completely capitulating to the corporate establishment. They're not fighting for us. They're just going to say Republicans bad. And anyone that criticizes us is being mean. It's too violent. I'm like, wow, you should never be a coach in professional sports, because if you were that much of a loser, you would have fans going, get the fuck out of here. And you'd be fired. And that's how that would happen. But, my question here is, what I'm seeing is that, I don't know, Biden's trying to get this infrastructure bill, which I'm like, it sounds good on paper, of course, but I'm sure there'll be a bunch of corporate, bailouts, and it won't help people. He could have helped. We don't have $15 an hour. We don't have Medicare. All these things Biden could have done, right?
Right.
So then, more than likely, that sets up the Democrats getting crushed in the midterms, which they'll probably love, because then they can really blame, Mitch McConnell and the Democrats, and their fundraising goes up. People will pay for that. But what's even scary, and I don't think the neoliberal, the vote any blue will do crowd they can't foresee this, because they just don't want to think, which is, Trump was an idiot, right? He was a dumb narcissist. He could have staged a coup. He could still be in power, and this country could be in a brutal civil war right now if he had read just
like a higher IQ.
Yeah, had a higher IQ. He just knew how to I can map this out. If he was Machiavellian.
Also, he had a lot of, I think, disdain for his own supporters.
He thought they were idiots. He's just,
and he told them, he repeatedly told them that he thought they were idiots.
Yeah, he's like, you're so dumb, you still vote for me. Yay! So he goes, and I'm sure he said to his buddies, I'll say anything, and these morons.
He said it out loud. He was like, I could shoot somebody. Remember back in 2016? Yes. He was like, I could shoot somebody in Central Park, and these people would still support me. And he was right.
He's saying that, that's saying you're so dumb, even if I do something awful, you'll support me. But what I don't think the Vote Any Blue Will Do crowd understands is what is brewing is, imagine somebody like Trump that tapped into, people, they never wanted to look at the fact that Trump ran a populist campaign in 2016. He wasn't populist in 2020. He was in 2016, he ran populist. Yes, xenophobic, racist,
also
sexist.
COVID really made it impossible for him to win a second term, I think.
Well, he handled it like an idiot. Had he handled it correctly, he would have won.
The Democrats, I don't think they could have easily beaten him had it not been for COVID.
Had he come in and handled COVID correctly, he would have been like, I'm number one. I'm COVID.
Yeah, if he had said everybody just checks, everybody would have voted for him.
Yeah, if he gave it, here's everybody $2,000, and if he would have done student debt forgiveness, I mean, people would have been like, fine, I hate this guy, but look, we're taken care of.
Yeah, right.
But I don't think they realize that what's coming on the horizon is an ideologue who's smart. Like, imagine a charismatic Mike Pence. Mike Pence is an evangelical. They're crazy. They're crazy people.
He's
can't
also
have
like
lunch
he's also like really boring. Like,
yeah,
you said he's not charismatic. Yeah.
He's not charismatic at all. But imagine somebody with that ideology that's charismatic.
Yeah.
Trump had the charisma of like just he tapped into the working white people, right? Imagine someone that was smart, that had a long game,
That's what I worry about. I worry about that. Like, I worry about Candace Owens.
Oh God.
I think she's someone who could be, I mean, she scares me because she's just like really good at arguing, even though what she's saying is nonsense. She's a great debater. And she feels like Republicans, if they were smart, would then have somebody who they could point to and say, see, we're not racist. I mean, I worry about what you're saying is like basically an ideologue who's more effective than Trump, like a right-wing ideologue who's more effective than Trump and can actually get elected, have this kind of fascist movement behind them, and do some real damage like that in a way that Trump couldn't. That's absolutely a fear. And ultimately what that does is it just keeps moving the goalposts further and further right. Like the Republicans move further right, and so do the Democrats. And then, we're left here being suppressed and like, basically like being like blacked out and censored. While liberals, even though they act like they are against Trump and against these, fascistic figures, what they actually end up doing is helping them, whether they mean to or not. They are ultimately allies. Like, without, they chose Hillary Clinton in 2016. Like, they chose somebody who could lose against the most unpopular candidate in history. Like, and this is like a routine throughout history, right? Is liberals would rather almost ally with fascists than with the left, because at the end of the day, like, they're all on the same team. They're being funded by the same people. They're working. Republicans and Democrats are working for the same people. They're really just one team with a few different ideas about tactics and like rhetoric, but ultimately they work for the same corporations. They're funded by the same corporations. So it's not surprising, but it is really scary given the moment we're in. And then you've got this looming threat of like climate change that's really never existed before. And that makes things even more scary because the world just feels really precarious. Like, it just feels like there's like a time limit to how long we have. There's a time limit to how long we have to fix things. And the closer we get to that time, that expiration date, like, it just feels like we're moving further and further into the wrong direction.
Yeah, because, Biden is doing his, as he said in the primary campaign, of like middle ground climate policy, like all of these like things like back in the the Paris climate accord and the we're going to lower emissions. It's like, oh, those are great ideas. If this was 1984, great ideas. Like,
like, where was this 30 years ago? Like, these things are like not going to do anything now. I'm not saying it's better to just like continue to destroy the world without any limits with carbon emissions, but like, it's so pathetic. And then, you mentioned the squad earlier. Like, I think one of the mistakes that I see, what I feel like the left is making, at least part of it, because the left is a very general term, but is, getting it wrong in the sense that, look, these politicians work for us. We got them elected, not the other way around. And instead of having this cult of personality where we're like, oh no, you can't ever criticize them, we should be pressuring them, because they aren't. The whole point of them not being corporately funded is that they're not being lobbied. Like, they don't have to listen to corporations and oligarchs. What they should be having to listen to is their base, but their base isn't pressuring them. Their base is actually a lot of their base is running interference for them and like defending them from having to actually do anything. And so it's just really frustrating to watch, because it's like, we should be pressuring AOC. We should be pressuring Ilhan Omar. We have to be. If the whole idea of them getting elected was to try to change stuff, we need to pressure them to change stuff or give up on this stupid party. Like, This is either we're not doing our job as like the left and pushing them, or this is just, another example of how the Democratic Party is not reformable and we should be building outside of it, or both. But like we can't have it all those ways.
Yeah, I agree. It's both. I mean, definitely pressure them, knowing full well that's never going to happen because you can't reform the party. So I think it's like really like it's never. I mean, I always use this example. I'm like, if we can reform the party from within, I'm like, great. I tell you what, you join the Democratic Party, try to reform within. I'm going to join a drug cartel and just start selling vegan smoothies instead of drugs, and we'll see who gets first.
Wins first.
Yeah,
I mean, they're not even talking about Medicare for all anymore. Like. No. They're not like, it's like, when is the last time you even heard that from a politician?
They introduced this bill, but they haven't forced the vote, which, I mean, again, what happened when Jimmy and everybody got on board with that forced the vote and how they were treated, how Jimmy specifically was treated. I was like, wow, this is real. This was truth serum for the left. We found out who's the boutique left and who's the real left.
Yeah.
And you cannot reform this Democratic Party from within. It is a joke to think that you can.
It's a conversation that's been being had my entire life. Like, I've heard this conversation my entire life is we just have to vote in more progressives. We just have to vote in more progressives. And every single time, like, what happens with the Democrats is they change you, not the other way around. Because how do you reform a party that's funded by Wall Street and the weapons industry? Like, they are beholden to those interests. You can't change that. Like, unless you're going to, get the party to stop being funded by those groups, which you're not, like, you cannot change it. They are still beholden to those groups, whether or not they have two people in the party that like have rhetoric that is leftist sounding. Doesn't make a difference. They're still funded.
Oh, wow. That was the corporate Democrats just cut her. They just cut her. They just cut her internet. Man, that's what happened. The military does her contract. Go, well, we've heard enough of her. Click. And they just shut that down. That's what happened. Oh my God. Well, hopefully she'll come back because this is fascinating having her on the show. I love talking to her. This is great. 609 people watching. Hit the like button. Oh, there she is.
See what happened? I don't know what happened. That was weird. There's a thunderstorm, so maybe I got knocked off the internet.
I know what happened. You were talking about the military-industrial complex, and they were
like, "Put it, get her off." I actually, on that note, I lost track of time because it's such a good conversation, but I do have to run in like 5 minutes.
Absolutely. Well, finish your thought.
What was that? Oh, just the Democratic Party. You cannot change a party that's funded by Wall Street and the weapons industry. It's just not possible. If people have tried to do it for the last 40 years, it hasn't worked. The party's just moved further and further and further right. And I think what Force the Vote showed is that, like, even the people who have been elected to this party to supposedly change it from within, to supposedly not be beholden to corporate interests, they're still too weak as a group to do anything. And they're still, at the end of the day, they're politicians, right? Like, they have their own personal ambitions, and they're not willing to give that up to actually do anything meaningful. And this is not to write off everything they do. I know it's not black and white, and I do have a nuanced view of this, but people just need to get the idea out of their heads that you can reform the Democratic Party. We should be building movements outside of it. If you go back to the New Deal, which everybody loves, Democrats love to hold up as so great. The New Deal happened because there was communist and socialist parties that were very powerful in the United States that organized strikes all the time. There were strikes constantly throughout the 30s and 40s. They're constantly. Mm-hmm. And that is what pushed things to change. Not FDR. Like, FDR didn't come into office being like, I'm going to give people things. Like, people demanded it and they organized for it. And they actually, there was a labor movement that was able to actually, hurt the pockets of the wealthy bosses. And that's why things changed. And, that goes back, we kind of started to go back full circle. We started talking about identity politics and how it kind of buries the issue of class. And that's why we need to get back to the roots of leftism, which is class, which is understanding that capitalism is the problem. We don't have a functioning labor movement in this country right now. That's a huge problem. That's like the only way to affect change is to strike, is to withhold labor. And we can't do that if we're just constantly obsessing about these individual identity issues. anyways, I just like, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I know what it's not. And it's not electing more people to the squad. Like, I don't know how many more squad members you need before there's proof that it isn't doing anything.
There's 100 members of the Progressive Caucus, and they do nothing.
They do nothing.
Nothing.
They do these like minor things, and they can't even win because they're not even willing to play politics or play hardball. Like, it's really just symbolic. They're like, look what we did, but they won't pressure Nancy Pelosi or go against her.
No.
So it's like, what use are you? Like, whereas Republicans actually do play ball, and Republicans actually do pressure and do like promise to, mess things up and be obstacles. And that's why they get their way.
And whenever they have power, they go, oh, we're going to do what we want. And people go, you can't do that. Then we have the majority.
Like,
we're going to do that.
Good luck. And then when the Democrats have power, because they're on the same team, right? Yeah. It's like a way for Democrats to justify never passing anything and never changing anything, is being like, oh, well, the Republicans won't let us. Even when they're in charge of like both houses of Congress and the White House, like they were in 2008, after Barack Obama won, they were like, oh, we can't do anything. Like, it's like, you're in charge of literally everything.
And you can't figure this out? And it's really, Mitch McConnell is holding the whole thing up. Really? Oh, interesting. Well, I know you got to run, so I appreciate your time. Tell people where they can follow you and listen to your shows and everything.
Thank you so much for having me on. And thank you everybody for watching. You can follow me at Rania Khalek on Twitter, as well as my work appears at Breakthrough News. I have a program called Dispatches, which you can catch on the Breakthrough News YouTube channel, and also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and everywhere you get podcasts, we have the audio version available. So thank you so much, Graham, for having me on. This was my first time on your show. I hope I can come back at some point.
Oh, whenever you want to come back.
This was a fun conversation.
Yeah, this was awesome. It was great having you on the show. Whenever you want to come back, and if you ever need me on one of your shows, I'll try to do what I can. So
thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll have to have you on at some point soon.
Absolutely.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Graham.
take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please hit the like button, the subscribe button. Go to patreon.com/Graham Elwood and rockfin.com/Graham Elwood, where you can support the show. Also, I have a Bitcoin wallet, a Bitcoin Cash wallet, and an Ethereum wallet in the show notes. We're taking cryptocurrency. I have a Coinbase affiliation link. We're going to be getting on some other exchanges. So that's how you support the show. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. YouTube is unsubscribing us at an alarming rate. I have a PayPal button at grahamelwood.com. I even have a Venmo at Graham-Elwood. There's a lot of ways to support our show. We are getting crushed by YouTube. We've dipped under 73,000 subscribers because of YouTube. Thanks for supporting what we do.